Thank you, Eileen, and thank you for that very generous introduction. It is a pleasure to speak to you all, and I hope that in this overview you get a good picture of clearly what I think is happening through this budget, but more broadly when we want to articulate in economic terms, but hopefully ones that you can access and understand what this current coalition government has been pursuing in its term, what the COVID pandemic has represented for its main goals, and how the budget, I think, is basically reflecting what is a deepening of their overall objective, which is to distribute as much wealth as possible upwards to higher income households, which are typically a voter base, and upwards to businesses. And they have done this through a spectacular reorganization of our taxation system, and they've used the COVID pandemic to hand out billions and billions of dollars without any conditions to their friends. And what this does is fuels like much more inequality, and it empowers one side and weakens the other. And as Eileen really well opened, we're here to talk about what it looks like for the other side. And I hope that, you get some good insights from this. So I'm going to share some slides because I put together a presentation. And I'm going to pop that up. And I should also say I'm coming from Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne, and we are preparing for our 1 week lockdown at least. So I'm calling this Rich Man Get Richer. The man is in the brackets, right? Because I'm a feminist and an economist and a materialist. And the fact is that at the top, the wealthier they get, the more men they become, more male they become. So we're talking about rich getting richer and rich men getting richer in this budget. This is where you can find my work at thefuturework.org.au and Twitter handles where I do some stuff. So I wanted to start off by saying, what did my bloody head in was, as soon as this budget dropped, everywhere in the media, we heard this narrative that this is an ideological pivot. We've seen some great change in the coalition government, nominally because they're preparing for an election, but this was absolutely not an ideological pivot, right? Let's take stock of what's happened in this budget. We've seen billions of dollars being given out to predominantly private operators, such as through the aged care, the childcare announcements. And those, when those billions have been handed out, little conditions have been attached to them. Traditionally, in policy, if there's more power among workers, they can ask and demand that when money is paid and given, that it's on the condition of providing good full-time jobs, decent conditions for people. But we haven't seen any of that. It's more money to friends. We've seen huge tax cuts to businesses and higher income households at the value of $30 billion every year in this budget. And that's predominantly through the stage 3 income tax layer of the program they announced last budget. But this is now for the wealthiest households. There's been no increase to income supports. $100 billion has been cut from personal incomes. So of all the incomes that working people need at this point in time, which we saw predominantly through the JobKeeper and the coronavirus supplement, they have cut them by $100 billion in the year. Those cuts happened in the lead up to the budget, but they're still part of the picture. We've seen the continuation of wage suppression, and I think it's important as something for people to keep in mind. Big spending doesn't mean that the agenda has changed, because actually undermining the safety net through income supports and public institutions like education and Medicare, that's a very expensive agenda. It's very expensive, the amount of money we provide to private healthcare, for instance, to try and undermine the Medicare system. So it's a way to sort of something to keep in mind. And even though what we're hearing from the government is that there's been this great and glorious recovery in the post-COVID rebound, employment is, actually up to pre-pandemic levels. Even this economic narrative is a very, very flimsy one. And this is what has been focused on at the Centre for Future Work, is to pull apart this story and poke the holes in it that are, they're gaping holes, really. First of all, what the government is saying when they say they expect the economy to grow in the next year, what they are assuming is that workers are going to continue to spend lots of money. They think that consumer spending is going to drive 70% of our growth in the next financial year. But they also, in their assumptions, say that the main sources of income, which are wages for people to spend, they actually predict that, well, they assume that there will be a large and sustained cut in real wages for 2 years behind CPI. So how can these two things come together, right? There's that glaring contradiction at the heart of the budget. Part of this story is that we have reopened the economy. It's happened much faster and stronger than we were expected. And that's partly because there was a lot of pent-up demand, in part through lockdowns, and people have gone out and spent what they could and what they had put aside. But that spending power is not going to hold us all the way through. And now we've seen, of course, our failure at mass vaccination, or the federal government's failure at mass vaccination, has led us highly vulnerable, and Victoria being a case in point right now. So what we're seeing is an economy that's entirely functioning on one cylinder. It's just all of the investment that it depends on is worker spending power right now. And that is a very flimsy, weak recovery. Other types of business recovery we would expect to happen, of areas of economic activity would expect to make up all of the different GDP, all the different parts of our national income. We'd expect business to be doing a lot more, right? But look what they've been doing in the recovery in 2020, the last 6 months of 2020, absolutely bloody nothing. They haven't put any of their booming profits back into investment, right? So when we say GDP growth is up, it is all of that column on the far left. 95% of that recovery has come from consumer spending. Government services spending is low, housing investment low, business investment the lowest of all. In fact, our trade balance has gone backwards. So what are government saying is going to happen in 21 and 22? Well, they think that workers are going to keep spending. They think that 70% of that recovery is going to come from workers. And still, for all the billions handed out to business, look at the fourth column across in this graph, they still don't expect business to be ploughing any of that public money that they've been gifted into new jobs, into long-term investment. And how is it that we'll have this recovery when they don't think that their assumption is that we won't have the wages to do it? And they can assume that because they also are diminishing the ability of workers to organise, and overall creating an economy where workers have no bargaining power. And so it's planned that we will have no wage increase. And of course, they're lobbying the Fair Work Commission to prevent an increase in the minimum wage, which would also turn this around. So alongside that contradiction at the heart of the budget, we've seen a bunch of these half measures, because basically, like, big campaigns and growing pressure on government to respond to crises that are coming up everywhere. We had the Aged Care Royal Commission, which was at the conclusion of many years of crisis. Government's committed 17.7 billion over 5 years. Research that we did at the Centre for Future Work said that even to meet the very minimum of the Royal Commission's recommendations to make sure that basically old people don't have maggots coming out of their wounds and people in the sector have the skills and the wages they need, you need 10 billion at least per year. So the government is only providing around a third of what's needed. Of course, there's been no improvement in the paying conditions of workers attached to that big money going out the door. In the education space, vocational education, 3 billion still been taken out since 2013. We've seen Job Trainer continue to be used to prop up a very uncoordinated private delivery of vocational education. The program is really poorly designed. I can't go into too much depth, but if people are interested, we can talk about it. And then we've seen the continued attack on the public university. What tiny remnants remain of public education in our university system are continuing to be attacked. 9.3% cuts in our funding to public unis. For all the rhetoric of needing to get more gas out of the ground to rebuild manufacturing in Australia, there is again no viable industry plan in the budget. And last time we built up manufacturing in Australia actually off the back of the Spanish flu, the last time we had a pandemic. because what happened is that people got angry about the fact that we couldn't make our own vaccines. And so the need to manufacture vaccinations was a really big, something that really provoked us to develop a manufacturing capacity. But still, we have a gas-fired recovery, which produces no jobs and is just exporting to other countries. And we don't have any vaccines. The other thing we heard from the government, as a product of like a combination of huge growing crises relating to women's economic security and safety, was this was going to be a women's budget. And this was because the last budget was very much focused on hard hats, even though there was a recognition that women copped it the worst in the worst of the pandemic in terms of losing more jobs, more hours. They're more likely to have to drop out of the labour market altogether to care for family and for children. And so there was this pressure on the government to come up with actually a proper attempt at addressing women's economic insecurity. And what else we had in the lead up to this budget is months of national anger about the sexual harassment crisis. Obviously, the one in Parliament, which continues to bubble, but then it opened up a broader discussion about sexual harassment on the job for women. And that created an environment where there was a push for government to provide actual, genuine structural reform on issues of gender inequality. And so from the 96 billion worth of taxing and spending measures, what is women's worth? They gave us 3.4 billion in this economic security statement, 3.6% of all the funding they put out. So you think about what kind of decades of structural inequality we're talking about that women face in employment, in superannuation, in their safety. And it's pretty clear, like, you're not going to do much with that kind of money, right? So what we saw for women was very much a short-term sweeteners, permanent rip-offs. The government wants to create the idea of comprehensive policymaking by throwing lots of small amounts of money at lots of different things, but actually no real reform has happened. 1.7 billion for childcare, far short of what's needed. Very token mentorship and women in business spending, which doesn't mean anything to the vast majority of working women in Australia. Big increases in DV funding, which was a small win, but then of course it cuts back in the forward estimates, 99%. It's cut back in 2025-26. And at the same time as these very small things have been thrown at women, there's been huge permanent changes being made in the tax system that is siphoning wealth upward. So I mentioned the stage 3 tax cuts that are going to proceed, which mostly benefit high-income households, but also analysis by the Australian Institute has shown that men receive double the benefit even in that one element of the budget alone. They're getting 12 billion per year that flows in benefits. Compare that 12 billion flowing to rich men to the 1.7 billion for all working women to improve the childcare system. It shows you what kind of scale we're looking at. We saw in some steps forward in superannuation changes, 4.7 million to allow women to earn super if they were earning below $450 a month. That increases their super balances by about 4.7 million, but compare that again to 29.5 billion that flows every year in tax concessions to men through the superannuation system, and in fact 18 billion more than for women. This is why in my op-ed on budget night, I called bullshit on this idea that this was a women's budget, and I said this is not a pink pill that I am going to swallow. One other measure I thought you guys might be interested in is the and I'm aware that I don't want to go over time, so and then I did last time, so someone just shut me up if you need me to, or maybe give me a 5-minute warning. So yeah, I wanted to point this one out because it was probably one of the most infuriating of all of the elements of offering to women is for single mothers, who are some of the the most struggling layers of our community in terms of their higher than broader population dependence on income support payments while they're raising children. In fact, 40% of all single parents rely on income supports predominantly for their income, so that's pretty high. And what government said is actually the ticket to your security is we'll give you the ability to pay for a house with a 2% deposit instead of normal with 20%. So I did the numbers on this, and if we assume that we don't want those families to be paying above 31% of all of their income on housing, which is the definition of housing stress, then forget housing altogether. For a single parent to even get a unit at a median price in Melbourne, they need $90,000 a year. They need to earn that kind of money. And how do we then match that up with single parents' median annual incomes, which are $77,000? That's including, that's the median, right? That's different if you're just relying on the $425 a week for the single parent payment. So it's $13,000 more than that is in reach for like the median single parent. What would have been way better is for the 100,000 women who are relying on very low parenting payments, is if you just lifted that payment. It's like the quickest way to improve the lives of 100,000 women and single parents. What do women really need? Higher incomes, better jobs, more jobs. And that's what didn't come in the budget, is investment in social infrastructure that was going to meet the need in the community, and one that would actually address the demand and the desire for Australians to expand our public services. Australian women need wage boosting policies. We need to lift the minimum wage, revitalise the awards. They need collective bargaining reform so they can actually bargain to get better outcomes on the job. And we need laws that don't criminalize very basic union activity that is legal in most of the democratic world, but in Australia is brutally, suppressed. Women need proper universal free public childcare, none of these tic-tac half measures. We need to rebuild our public TAFE and universities, and women need a national public housing program, who disproportionately make up the 500,000 people waiting for public housing right now, and a retirement income system that doesn't bake in the inequality that they face on the job already. And I'll start moving towards the ending, guys, because what this is, I guess, we're talking about improving the lives for women, which is improving the lives of working people more broadly. And really, there's no way about this, because given the government's very flimsy assumptions around the state of our economy right now, the way they think we're going to rebuild, the way they want to present it as being strong and basically everyone should shut up, that's not going to last. Like the contradictions and the problems that we face in terms of a growing, powerful layer of society through increasingly richer households and businesses, they are pursuing ruthlessly an agenda to make people poorer so they can make more money, and that's not going to stop. So we really need a public sector-led reconstruction program. We talk about reconstructing an economy, not tinkering with what we have now. We need to rebuild it with public institutions at the heart of that, and that means committing to creating an economy of full employment, repairing our health system, and a bunch of things that I've raised of issues that women need to have addressed for them. But it's getting to the housing, skills and training, and obviously addressing the dire need for a climate transition, investing in that. And this isn't going to happen because people in policy do it for us. It's going to happen because we organise for it. And this is why at the Centre for Future Work, we focus on providing ideas and analysis and tools essentially to arm up campaigns and the labour movement to be able to pursue these goals for themselves. And we'll do that alongside you, of course. And I think to get there, we need cross-union civil society campaigns for a people-led economy. We need to be thinking about a new model of economic growth that is more public-led, is more democratic, that is focused on meeting human needs. And I wanted to give a shout out to New Zealand, Aotearoa, because I keep an eye on our friends across the ditch, and I think that they've been showing a lot of leadership in this cross-union civil society work. The Living Wage campaign is something that in a spirit of, as Eileen put forward, of us putting forward ideas, I think it's a really inspirational one. It brings together anti-poverty organisation, welfare rights groups, and unions organising in low-wage sectors. And they've got some significant wins across Woolworths, the equivalent of Woolworths. They've got living wages at McDonald's. where we've got, 13-year-olds on, $7, $8 an hour. They've got 13-year-olds on $23 an hour. Don't quote me on that. I've got to get it. And it's something that is now going to be broadened out because New Zealand has introduced sectoral bargaining. So they've now got a new weapon and a new framework to broaden out the campaign for a living wage, to increase the number of jobs and to improve the quality of those jobs. And it's something that brings together the whole community. So thank you. I'll leave it there.